Hey everybody, today Rahdo runs through his top 10 game mechanisms, which I think is going to be a quick, fun, easy little run through to do. Basically, there's two ways I could have attacked this. I opted for making a list of broad categories of gameplay mechanisms that Jen and I tend to enjoy quite a bit. If ever I find a game that has one of these mechanisms, I'm instantly drawn to it. If ever I find a game that has 2 or 3 of these game mechanisms, forget about it. It's almost a must-have, sight unseen. And now this is instead of what I thought about doing, and maybe saying, let's not talk about a big, broad category of a particular type of mechanism, but talk about specific instances of weird, neat, little quirky things that, oh wow, look at Game X. It does this thing. I've never seen it anywhere before. This is clearly one of the coolest game mechanisms I've ever seen. I thought that was like a little bit too specific, and so I decided to go broad. Heck, maybe somewhere down the road a different top 10 would be to cover, specific, unique game mechanisms. But for today, I'm going for kind of big picture stuff here. Not like genres of games. I mean, some people might say, hey, co-op is a gameplay mechanism. No, it's not. It's a genre of game. Real time is a genre of game. Dexterity is a genre of game. I'm going for specific mechanisms that would exist inside of a given genre. Make sense? Okay, then let's get going. For each one of these, I am also going to haul out the box for my favorite game, my top-rated game, that features strongly this particular category of gameplay mechanism, whatever it might be. And without further ado, let's get going. Also, one more thing. I am going to continually refer to these as gameplay mechanisms, not gameplay mechanics, because yes, I'm one of those guys who thinks it's ridiculous anytime anybody starts talking about their favorite gameplay mechanics, because that's just not how the word works. I don't mind if that's what you want to call mechanisms, you want to call them mechanics, that's cool, but without further ado, this is much waffling about nothing. Now let's actually start counting down my number 10 gameplay mechanism, simultaneous, what would I call it? Simultaneous action selection. And Dungeon Pets is a really wonderful, wonderful example of this. This is a mechanism whereby players all have to plan in secret what it is they want to do, what they want to accomplish in a given round, and then everybody pulls back the secret shield they've been working under, reveals what they're going to do, and that fallout then leads to, well, probably a very interesting round of, right, I was able to do half of what I wanted to do, but oh my God, I had no idea you were going to do that. Now that's going to prevent me from doing the other half of what I want to do. How am I going to recover from that? It's interesting. Every one of these mechanisms, I think, it's a pretty common refrain throughout here that these are all different ways of games limiting what I can do as a player, putting me in positions where I have to respond to some kind of rule or external stimuli that makes me have to think on my feet about, well, maybe I wanted to do X, but now I've got to come up with something else because there is a mechanism that has put me, in a corner, and now I've got to solve that problem. That's what I enjoy so much about board games, and Dungeon Pets is a wonderful example because at the beginning of every round, you can see the run-through I've done of this, we all plan in secret how we are going to deploy our workers in this worker placement game. And the configurations of groups of shoppers, because they're all going to go into town to do worker placement type stuff. Every time when I reveal my stuff and I thought, oh, I was going to get to go first. Oh no, you made a bigger group of shoppers. You're going to get to go first. That means you're probably going to get the thing I was desperate to get. Now that I can't do that, I've got a group of shoppers who, well, am I going to even use those guys at all? How am I going to respond to that? That's what I love so much about, that tension. I'm working, in secret, trying to come up with a perfect plan, not only for what I need to do, but also to anticipate what you're going to do, because your plans could, through no fault of your own, completely scupper mine. So I have to think broader than just about what I need, but also about what you need so that I can work within those confines. And it's brilliant. I mean, every game, Fresco is another wonderful example of simultaneous action selection. Although Dungeon Pets, which is in my top 10 games of all time, is my number 1 example. So that was mechanism number 10. Now moving on to number 9, Rondels. I absolutely love Rondels, and there is no more Rondelly game out there than Die Werft, or Shipyard, as it's also called in English. Now, a Rondel is let's see, I think they're almost always circular, although I don't particularly care about the fact that they're circular. A Rondel is an action selection mechanism that in various different ways, depending on which game we're talking about, restricts what I can do from round to round based on what I have done in the previous round. Unlike, say, a worker placement game where, barely the only thing that's restricting me is what spaces are available. In a Rondel game, if I do X in turn 1, then that restricts me to Y, Z, or what's another letter, in the next round. And so, while I'm doing what I want to do right now, I have to be thinking about what's that going to let me do in the future. I absolutely love it. Now, of course, Matt Gertz is the king of the Rondel. I think some people argue that he introduced Rondels to modern board gaming in Antique, I believe. And certainly, Navigador and Hamburger are wonderful examples. And, there's Finca. There's lots of really cool Rondel-based games out there, and they don't always even necessarily have a circular thing. There's lots of ways you could do it. But I'm going to call out Shipyard, not only because it's like in my top 15 games of all time, but because this is Rondel mania. There's like 4 or 5, there are Rondels within Rondels in this game. And so it's a ridiculously intricate and lovely puzzle of trying to resolve, right, okay, if I do this on this Rondel, how's that going to limit me in the future? Because on the next one, I need to do that, but on the previous turn, I'd done that on that Rondel. It's absolutely wonderful. I love Rondels. I mean, they just work so beautifully. No matter what system they use to actually limit. Usually, as a general rule, Vikings is a Rondel where you're on a circular thing and, how much money you're willing to spend or how far you can move on it. In the Matt Gertz games, it's just a very hard and fast rule. Once you've done one, you can only move clockwise 1, 2, or 3 spaces forward unless you're willing to pay more. There's lots of different ways they could work, but they always work so nicely and they create really interesting, tough decisions. So that's my number 9 mechanism, Rondels. Now, number 8, time tracks. And time tracks were really kind of popularized in a game, came out like 5 or 6 years ago called Thebes. Although some people say that Newland came out around the same time, and I'm not sure which one owns time tracks. And it's interesting. It's a wonderful mechanism. I love it in Thebes. I love it in Thebes, the card game, but you don't really see it in very many games. It's in Olympos is another one where it works so wonderfully. But I think my favorite instance of time tracks I've ever played is Glenmore. Now, what a time track is basically, again, coincidentally, like the Rondel, it's a track, a looping track that goes around, and players put their player order markers on them. And basically, when it comes around to my turn, I can pick up my character. Actually, it's interesting. Shipyard has kind of a time track in it as well. Now that I think about it, its main Rondel is kind of a time track. But anyway, so what I do is I pick up my marker, and now I can move clockwise however far I want along there to grab something. In the case of Glenmore, it's a specific tile that I want to move forward and grab. And if I'm being conservative, I only want to move clockwise a few steps, because if I move a lot of steps, that means I'm not going to get to go for a while, because at any given time, a time track is a mechanism that determines player order. And so if I make a big move and go halfway around this track to grab something that's really important to me, that means all the other players are going to get several turns if they take little baby steps around the track before I get to go again. But if I'm desperate for that thing that's so far, in this case, in the case of Glenmore, if I'm desperate for that tile that is going to be central to my plans, but I can't risk anybody else grabbing it. So I do make that big jump, and I realize, wow, me doing this is giving my opponents like 3 or 4 turns in a row before I get to go again. But it's worth it. That is an agonizingly sweet decision to have to make to balance your immediate needs for doing more actions, or even worse, giving your opponent lots more actions, as opposed to your long-term needs of grabbing this thing. Thebes, when I mentioned it, it's not about necessarily grabbing something off the track itself, like what Glenmore does. It's simply saying, you know what, this turn I'm going to do an action that takes me a lot of time. That's the same thing for the way Olympos works it too. And if I do an action that takes a lot of time, that means other players can do lots of short actions in the same amount of time, and they get to do a lot more stuff. So if I'm going to do a slow, long action that takes me out of the loop for a while, it better be worth it. It's an amazing gameplay mechanism. One of my favorites. Obviously, it's on my top 10. And I'm shocked it doesn't show up more, because it just works so well. And you could apply it to so many games out there. But it just seems to be kind of this forgotten thing that, certainly Matthias Kramer, because heck, he did it in Glenmore, and then he revisited it in Kraftwagen, another excellent example of the time track. Absolutely phenomenal. My number 8 mechanism, time tracks. Now, moving on to number 7. And this one's kind of an odd one because this is a mechanism that is specifically an element of cooperative games. And as a general rule, the best cooperative games out there use this mechanism. And surprisingly, very few of them do. What mechanism am I talking about? Well, it doesn't even have a name, so I had to make a name for it myself. I called it the Cycling Event Deck, and it was really popularized in Pandemic, or in Pandemic Legacy in this case. Although, I've pretty much gotten rid of regular Pandemic. Pandemic Legacy is my version of Pandemic. I've talked about that elsewhere. That's neither here nor there. But it's the notion, and this is, event decks are something you see in a lot of co-ops. Heck, I think pretty much almost every co-op out there. There's very few that don't rely on representing the external force that players must struggle against. There's something, in the case of Pandemic, it's viruses spreading all over the world that we have to work to stop the spread of. Usually it's a very common thing in cooperative games and competitive games too, that there is some deck that every round, after all the players have done their stuff, you draw a card from the deck, and that's the game striking back and pushing back against you, kind of replicating a dungeon master, an evil dungeon master who's trying to destroy you all. It's represented by that deck of cards. And usually, like in, say, Ghost Stories or whatever, you set up that deck of cards, you shuffle it up, you put it there, and often the game end is resolved when you have survived to the end of that deck of cards. I never really find that, that works okay, but what designer Matt Leacock did with Pandemic's event deck is so much more powerful, so much more incredible, because you cycle it. It recycles itself. In Pandemic, the way it specifically works is you go through this event deck and it's making more and more cubes spread all over the world, these virus cubes that you have to fight. But there ultimately comes a time where a specific thing happens that causes you to take all the cards that had previously been played out of the event deck, shuffle them up, and then put them back on top of the deck. And so now you're going to continue playing the same way. You're going to continue drawing cards at the end of every round from the event deck, or I forget what it's called, the virus deck, or whatever, the event deck. You're going to go through it again. But in the case of Pandemic, you now have a rough idea of what's coming. And that simple little twist on event decks, which, like I said, exists in lots of cooperative and competitive games. It's a really common thing. But the fact that Pandemic introduced, this is heavy. I've pretty much got five expansions worth of stuff in this box. It's too heavy for me to hold up anymore. Anyway, the notion that was introduced in Pandemic that sometimes the deck surprises you because, I have no idea what's coming. I've got no idea what's coming. But then you get to the point where, now I do have a rough idea of what's coming, and I can start making stronger, more interesting, more intricate plans based on the knowledge I have of the event deck. The event deck is not a completely random, chaotic, unknown entity that I just have to go on a roller coaster ride and hope it works out for me. The fact that that event deck cycles, and you see this in other Matt Leacock games. You see this in Forbidden Desert as a perfect example, because you have one deck that you go through multiple times over the course of the game, and there are specific things in that deck that you have to be planning for and waiting for. And after they've hit, like the sun beats down, you can take a breather because you've prepared for it. And you have to be thinking about, right, next round I'm going to be drawing 3 cards from that deck. Is the thing I think is going to happen? Well, there's a 50-50 chance based on how much is in the deck. That extra level of giving players control over chaos because they have limited, imperfect information of what's coming is brilliant, is absolutely beautiful. Another great example of it is Tiny Epic Defenders. That's maybe the most pure example of a cycling event deck, because the entire game is driven by an event deck that builds over time, and you keep running through over and over and over again. And it has all these high points and low points, and you have to prepare for those low points. You have to be ready to capitalize on those high points, and it just works so great. Designers out there, if you're working on a cooperative game and you're planning on putting an event deck in and saying, oh, well, yes, there's 50 cards. And of course, once the player gets through them all, the game will be over, like Ghost Stories. Maybe think twice. Maybe say, yeah, there's 50 cards, but in a given game, there's only going to be 20. And the first time you go through the deck, you learn what's in there, but then you go through the deck 2 more times, and now you can have big, strong strategic planning, and that's what I love. That's what a cycling event deck does for me, that makes it my number 6 gameplay mechanism of all time. Now, let us move on to my number 5. Hold on a second. Cycling was 10, 9, 8, 7. Oh, sorry. Cycling event decks was my number 7. Now, moving on to my number 6 is, all right, card drafting. And when people talk about card drafting, well, in my top 10, I gotta go with Seven Wonders. Although this doesn't mean simply the Seven Wonders, Sushi Go, Notre Dame style. Hey, everybody's got their hand of cards, right? I'm gonna pick one of these cards to play, and then I hand the rest to you, and then you hand me yours, and we just keep cycling. I mean, that's a wonderful card draft. I love it. It's always just makes for amazingly agonizing, thought-provoking, deep decisions, because not only am I thinking about, okay, what do I need to do right now, but I'm also thinking about, oh my gosh, but I can't let you do this. I can't let you have this card, but I don't need this card. Should I let you have it? But then also I'm thinking, oh, if I play this card, and then when they come back to me, if this card is still here, this card plus this card would be amazing, but is there any chance I'm going to get that card back? There's just like this explosion of wonderful thought processes that goes into managing a card draft. It just almost always works without exception. It's an incredibly easy because so much of the gameplay is about is out thinking your player, understanding what it is that they need, because you're about to feed them a lot of good stuff, and you have to be very careful about doing that. Now, I should say, like I said, Seven Wonders is a wonderful example of it. There's so many more, Among the Stars and whatnot, but like I said, I'm not limiting myself just to that whole, I've got my cards, you've got your cards, we'll swap them around. I mean, Nations is a fantastic card drafting game because everybody's drafting from a common pool. Hey, you know what? Let's just put all the cards out there right on the table, and we know, okay, I need that card, but oh my gosh, I need that card even more. But you need that card. Should I grab that one even though I don't need it as much? Because hopefully the card I really need is still going to be there next turn. Whether it's a private thing that you're handing that pool back and forth, whether it's a big public pool, card drafting, and drafting in general. I mean, this applies towards tile drafting for that matter, like in, Castles of Burgundy. I mean, just drafting in general. But 9 times out of 10, it comes in the form of cards. Sometimes in the form of tiles, like you see that in Suburbia as an example of a tile drafting game. Drafting in general is great. My favorite iteration of it, probably the Seven Wonders style. But I almost always enjoy it. It always creates interesting, fun, cool, tense experiences. Much like this one. Am I going to make it through this now that I'm actually choking on my own spit? Let's find out. Let's keep going with my number 5 favorite mechanism, tile laying. I love laying tiles out on a table. It's very, very cool and wonderfully satisfying to kind of build this thing up over time and bearing in mind that, okay, well, I'm building this and I'm leaving this space here empty because I'm hoping to get this other tile later on that will go there, and then those things will actually synergize together. There's so many wonderful tile games out there. Of course, I say tiling, everybody thinks of Carcassonne, but honestly, Jen, we're not big fans of Carcassonne. We love Carcassonne Castle. Carcassonne the Castle is amazing. But my number 1 tile laying game of all time, that's got to be Keyflower. And now, don't get me wrong, there's a lot of other cool stuff in Keyflower. It's an amazing auction game as well. Auctions, I thought about it long and hard, did not make my top 10. There's so many things that didn't make my top 10, but heck, I'll talk more about that in a podcast. If people have questions about, hey, what about X, Y, or Z? Talk to me about it. It'll be mentioned in the next podcast. But anywho, the tile laying in Keyflower, which is another one of my top 10 games of all time, is absolutely phenomenal. It's a perfect example of the form. There's all these tiles out there that we're drafting for, although we're doing it through an auction mechanism. But heck, it's got a cool tile draft. We're trying to grab those tiles to actually play some. I mean, heck, I already mentioned it. Glenmore is another amazing tile laying game, which just has the time track. Again, I said right up front, any game that has multiples of these expansions, mechanisms, is probably going to become one of my favorite games of all time. Glenmore, that's certainly the case. Keyflower, that's certainly the case. I mean, actually, Shipyard, now that I think about it, this is a tile laying game too. The notion of having all these physical things, because it's so satisfying to build this thing that when the game is over, I can sit back and say, this is what I've created, whether it's a kingdom, whether it's a mighty ship, whether it's a small town in New England that is particularly good at running a particular engine because I've designed it such by putting all the things out there. Tile laying, it just scratches a wonderful, wonderful itch. Particularly that's the problem with Carcassonne. Carcassonne is just too simple. But a tile laying game like Keyflower, where not only are you just worrying about, okay, I just need to make sure I can place my tiles legally, but I have to be thinking half a game ahead of time, because if I put this tile here, this tile in Keyflower that say generates iron that I'm going to need over on this other tile that's on the other side of my entire table, am I actually going to be able to transport the iron from one place to another so I can upgrade that other tile? If I'm not going to be able to, I need to find out a better way to lay those two tiles so they're close together. But there's no way to do that because the roads don't actually work out. I mean, those kinds of tough, thorny decisions Absolutely love it. And that's why tile laying, a key flower, but heck, several others I've already mentioned, is such a wonderful. I talked about card drafting in Seven Wonders. Among the Stars mixes card drafting with tile laying. Anyway, that was number 5. Number 4. Yes, okay. I called this one dice activation. And originally, I was going to call this dice worker placement along the lines of what you see in the Alien Frontiers or Kingsburg or Dark Horse, or Thrash and Roll or Voyages of Marco Polo. Dice worker placement is amazing. Interestingly, I was shocked as I thought more and more about this list of mechanisms. Worker placement did not make my top 10. I like worker placement, but I don't love it. Just vanilla worker placement by itself is not enough to really get my blood pumping. But when you make the workers dice, then things get really, really interesting because it's not just, I've got this group of people, I'm going to try and deploy them as best I can on the spaces available to me. When they're dice, I never know who those people are going to be. Euphoria, another great example of a dice worker placement game. So I'm constantly having to mitigate the roll of the dice. Hey, I want to do this particular action, but oh my God, I didn't roll any 6s this turn. Or I didn't roll any 1s, which is what I needed to do this other action. I just got 3s and 4s. How am I going to use this? What am I going to do with it? And so originally I was just going to say dice worker placement. I mean, worker placement was not good enough, but you add dice to it if something becomes good enough. But then I realized, wait a minute. My number one example of rolling dice, seeing what I get, and then figuring out how to leverage them isn't a worker placement game because it's Roll for the Galaxy. And that's why I had to change this to dice activation. That every round there are actions I want to do. And you can't really call, I don't know. The dice you have in Roll for the Galaxy are definitely workers. I roll them. They represent the population I've got in my intergalactic empire that I'm building, and it lets me decide how am I going to deploy my workforce. Some people don't consider this a worker placement game, though, because to be officially worker placement, players have to be able to block each other, and of course you don't do that because you're only activating your own tiles. Oh my God, no, this is not really a tile laying game because it doesn't really matter how you put them next to each other. But wow, that'd be a great expansion, turning this into an actual logistical tiling. Anyway. Sorry, maybe that's going to be something that comes in the future where it actually matters where you put your tiles next to each other. Oh, wow, that'd be amazing. But anyway, that's why I had to change this from just dice worker placement to dice activation, or because it's less about the traditional tropes of worker placement of, there's only 5 spaces out there on the board and each of us are only going to get to do 3 actions. Who's going to get squeezed out? That's not what's interesting to me. What's interesting to me is, there's 5 different types of things I can do this round. I roll the dice. Now, how am I going to use these dice? Based on what came up, how am I going to do them? And that could be a worker placement thing. That could be something like this. But I absolutely love it because this is another thing that I've noticed. I mentioned right up front that it's a really consistent refrain for me that I'm looking for mechanisms, or I'm drawn to mechanisms that restrict me, that compress my concept. And this actually, it is kind of consistent because I've often talked in video games about how, as a general rule, both Jen and myself, we don't respond well to sandbox games that allow you to do whatever you want, that try to take shackles off of you. We want shackles. We want the game to say, because of X, Y, and Z, you've got A, B, or C. You can do one of those 3 things. D, but it's really not that good. Which of these 3 things are you going to do based on the circumstances you find yourself in? That's what I love. I love a game that gives me a problem to solve. And now I got to figure out how best to do it. As opposed to a game that says, hey, you know what? Just do whatever you want. Maybe you'll make your own problems to solve. Or I like games that give me a problem to solve as opposed to games that let me set my own goal I chase after. And so, dice activation, as typified by Roll for the Galaxy, is a perfect example of that mechanism that I absolutely love. But we're not done yet because now we are going to move on to number 3. Let's see. I'll just hold it up. It's Dominion. It's deck building. I love deck building so much. It kind of harkens back to what I was talking about with tile laying. The fact that over the course of a given game, I'm actually building something. These are engine building games. And actually, I thought about putting engine building on this list, but that didn't make sense to me. Engine building is not a mechanism. Engine building is a goal that you try to achieve by leveraging mechanisms. And so while engine building is not a mechanism to me, Deck building, which is a way to create an engine, is a mechanism. Although, I didn't write down on my list here deck building because while, Dominion and all the many games that followed after it have spawned probably one of the most popular mechanism genres there is. I mean, right after worker placement, deck building's got to be way up there. Even now, even all these years later, there's still dozens of really good and some not so good deck builders that come out every year. I'm always enjoying them, no matter what, just because the core conceit of, right, I need to build this thing. And now, as I'm building it over the course of the game, I need to use it. I need to leverage it. But the thing is, it's an imperfect engine. It's not a perfect engine because I can never be certain I've put stuff into it, but from round to round, I don't know what I'm going to pull out. And in much the same way that from round to round with a dice activation game, I don't know what my little workers are going to do. I love that a deck builder, I have no idea what that deck is going to do. I have a rough idea because I built it. I planned it with certain ideas in mind, but it has a mind of its own. And once again, when the card draw doesn't give me what I was hoping for, I've got to come up with a solution to that problem. Now, but again, I can't say deck builders because I have to say pool builders because over the last couple of years, there's been this explosion of what are more colloquially called bag builders, where instead of building a deck of cards, you're filling up a bag full of stuff. And oh my gosh, that's so amazing. Orleans, where's Orleans? Right, it's, I think it's up off camera, or am I blind? I know I have it on the shelf here. But anyway, Orleans is an example. Automobiles. I'm actually going to be doing a run-through for that probably later this week. It's a phenomenal. We love pool building, a pool of resources that you can never 100% predict how it's going to behave, but you have to exhaust it before you can refresh the pool and start it working again. Oh my gosh, it just works so well. So much so that while Jen hates sports games, hates racing games, she, the first time we played automobiles, she said, oh my gosh, this is a fantastic game because the mechanisms of pool building, previously known as deck building, but now pool building is amazing, and that's why it's my number 3. We're almost done, folks. On to my number 2. And actually, for the longest time, if you had asked me what my favorite gameplay mechanisms, I would have said multi-use cards, which there are very few games out there that leverage the idea of cards you can use in different ways than Glory to Rome. Although there's, it's actually a real, what's it? Seven Wonders does this too. Seven Wonders, you're drafting for multi-use cards as an example, but Glory to Rome is kind of the high watermark for, these cards, I can use them as building materials, I can use them as actions, I can use them as modifiers to control other actions, I can use them as victory point things. You've got tons of different ways to use them. And I just love, in any game that does this, it's very rare that even the most mediocre of multi-use card gameplay mechanisms, I still find myself drawn into them because that notion of, I've got these cards, I want to use this card for this, how am I going to do that? The most common way you find that is, again, the Race for the Galaxy thing, the San Juan thing of, the multi-use is I can either play this card to add to my tableau, or I can use this card as money to pay for a card to be played. I want to play this card. Oh, it requires me discarding 3 cards. That's multi-use right there. But Glory to Rome goes so far beyond that. It's not just 2 uses for every card. And that's the same thing, basically, I should say, that Seven Wonders does as well. I can play this card to put it out, or I can trash this card, multi-use to get money for later things, or I can trash this card to build a wonder. That's 3 uses for a card. Glory to Rome has 5 or 6. La Granja, an amazing game. It also is in my top 20 because it does such a wonderful job of creating multi-use cards. It's just an incredibly compelling and compulsive puzzle to me. Every round, I've got these cards. What am I going to do? I want to do this. I want to do this. I want to do this. I can't do all these things. How am I going to prioritize? Oh, it's just brilliant. Oh, and actually, it's funny. I should mention La Granja, which is a great example of multi-use cards. I love it. Another reason La Granja rates so high for me is because it mixes and matches 2 of my favorites. My number 2 favorite multi-use cards, and I have to admit, my relatively recently identified number 1 favorite game mechanism of all time, as typified by my top 10 favorite TWA, what I call it, dice drafting. And now this is kind of cheesy. I almost felt, because I talked at length earlier in this run through about drafting in general and how you often find it in, like Seven Wonders is a great card drafting game. Subdivision is a wonderful tile drafting game, and Nations and Castles of Burgundy. These are all different ways to do drafting. But to me, there is something really, 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 really special about drafting dice. About every round, there is a common pool, not dice action worker. What did I call it? Not the I've totally forgotten the names I had to make for it because I couldn't call it dice. Oh yeah, dice activation, where I've got my own private dice. I'm going to use them every round as best I can. That's cool. But what's much cooler is Trois. There is a communal pool of dice. And it's not just Trois you've seen this in. There's been an explosion of dice drafters over the last year. Panamax kind of ushered in this new, but Trois has been around for years and years and years, and it's an amazing dice drafter. And I don't think there's any better culmination of all the stuff that, gets me excited. Really restricting me, making me have to come up with the best plan with, tight restrictions that are somewhat predictable, but not fully predictable. I can plan up to a certain extent, but they will surprise me, and I have to come up with new plans on the fly after I roll those dice and see what they give me. But oh my gosh, there's just so many games, and it just works so phenomenally. Like I said, I was just saying a second ago, it works so wonderfully in La Granja, which takes multi-use cards, but then in the middle of a round, you do a dice draft. It almost kind of feels tacked on. It's just like, hey, in the middle of this wonderful multi-use card game, we do a dice draft in the middle. Why? Because it's so good. Dice drafting is amazing. Because, like I said, it ties everything I've just talked about all into one. The having to make both long-term strategic moves plus short-term tactical moves based on what the dice ultimately do versus what I was hoping they do, and also having to pay a lot of attention to my opponents because I'm not going to get all those dice. I'm only going to get half of those dice or a third of those dice or whatever it is based on the game and how many people are playing. How do I prioritize the dice I want, the dice I need? The same thing happens in card drafting, but in a card drafting game, it's all kind of preordained. The cards themselves don't change. The tiles themselves don't change. They're out there. Every round we're going to get the ones we want. But with dice drafting, you never know what you're going to get. It's constantly putting you on your heel, keeping you on your feet. And that's why it is my number one favorite game mechanism. Just absolutely phenomenal. And I'm so excited. Every time I'm constantly reading about, oh yeah, we're developing a new dice drafting game. Like I said, it's the new hotness, and I'm so excited because it's my favorite. It's my favorite hotness. And that's it, folks. My top 10 game mechanisms. Now, if you have any questions, comments, concerns, as always, please let me know. If you feel that I've created an egregious, horrific, unthinkable oversight because I should have talked about X, Y, or Z, by all means, comment. I'll bring it up if I'm like, oh yeah, that's a good point. What about X, Y, or Z? I'll talk about that in my next podcast that I'm probably going to record next week. So you got a few days. Otherwise, hopefully this was of some interest to you. And so I'm just going to sign out there and say, thanks for watching, everybody. Talk to you later. So long. Bye-bye.